Right, let's get straight into it. Today on the Deep Dive, we're tackling a big one, the Cold War. And specifically for anyone, studying their GCSE history, particularly that bit about conflict and tension between East and West, 1945 to 72. This is definitely for you.
Yeah.
We're not just looking at the face-off between the two big dogs, the USA and the Soviet Union. We're going to explore how this whole global power struggle really played out, across the world.
Exactly. It's easy sometimes to just frame it as like a two-way street, USA versus USSR.
Yeah.
But the reality was much messier. This clash of ideas, capitalism versus communism, it sent ripples everywhere. It affected events miles and miles away.
So our mission today is to try and connect some of those dots, see how these different events fit into that bigger East-West tension.
That's the plan. Show how it all manifested globally during this really crucial period.
Okay, so where do we start? I guess Germany makes sense. That image of a divided Germany, and especially Berlin. It's so iconic, isn't it?
Yep. Absolutely fundamental. You have to understand the division of Germany after World War II to get the Cold War's early stages.
Right.
So the Allies, that's the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, they each got a zone of occupation. The US Southwest, Britain Northwest, France a smaller bit in the West, Soviets in the East.
And that was supposed to be temporary.
Well, that was the initial idea, yeah. But as the relationship between the West and the Soviets soured, that division just hardened.
Okay.
And by 1949, it was formalized. You had West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, aligning with the West, and East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, firmly in the Soviet camp.
But Berlin was the really tricky part, wasn't it? Because it was deep inside East Germany, but also divided into 4 zones.
Exactly. That's what made it such a flashpoint. Imagine, having this little island of Western control slap bang in the middle of your territory.
Yeah, that sounds unstable.
It was a constant source of friction. The Western Allies had a symbolic and practical foothold right inside the Soviet sphere, and then, the Soviets decided to act.
The Berlin blockade, June 48.
That's the one. Stalin tried to force the Western powers out by cutting off all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, essentially trying to starve them out.
But the West didn't blink, did they? They came up with the airlift.
They did. The Berlin airlift was, it was extraordinary. For nearly a year, American and British planes flew in everything: food, fuel, medicine, nonstop.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about supplies, though. It was a massive show of logistical power, a political statement. It showed the Soviets and the world that the West wouldn't be pushed around.
And it really cemented Berlin's status, didn't it, as the front line?
Absolutely. The Iron Curtain, Churchill talked about, Berlin was where you could almost touch it, right in the heart of Europe.
Okay, so while this is happening in Germany, the Soviets are also consolidating their influence elsewhere in Eastern Europe, creating this buffer zone.
Yeah, Stalin was obsessed with security, understandably perhaps, given what Russia had gone through in the war. He wanted a belt of friendly communist states on his western border to protect against any future attack from the West.
So this meant setting up communist governments in places like Poland, Hungary, Romania.
Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria.
Yeah.
Yes. Often using methods that weren't exactly democratic, coercion, rigged elections, that sort of thing.
How did the Soviets justify this?
Yeah.
And how did the West see it? Because they must have seen it very different.
Totally different perspectives. You had, say, Moscow radio in 1949 broadcasting that these countries now had true political freedom.
Right.
But then you look at a British cartoon from 1947 showing Stalin basically planting Soviet flags all over Eastern Europe by force. That was the Western view, Soviet expansionism, breaking wartime agreements about free elections.
And Yugoslavia under Tito managed to stay communist but independent.
Yes, Tito was a thorn in Stalin's side. He pursued his own communist path, refusing to just take orders from Moscow. It showed not everyone in the East was under direct Soviet control, but it was the exception.
This control, though, wasn't always stable. Which brings us to the Hungarian uprising in 1956. What kicked that off?
Well, there was huge discontent in Hungary. Years of harsh rule under the hardline leader Rákosi, plus food shortages, lack of freedom. People were deeply unhappy.
And then Khrushchev came along in the USSR.
Exactly. Khrushchev's speech in early 56 criticizing Stalin's crimes, the whole de-Stalinization thing, it gave people hope, especially in places like Hungary and Poland. They thought, maybe things could change, maybe we can have a slightly different path.
And Imre Nagy, he tried to bring in reforms.
He did. Nagy became prime minister again, and he started talking about free elections, more freedoms, and the really big one, taking Hungary out of the Warsaw Pact.
That sounds like crossing a line from Moscow.
A massive red line. The Warsaw Pact was the Soviet military alliance, their answer to NATO. Letting a member leave? Unthinkable. It could unravel the whole bloc.
So Khrushchev's response?
Was brutal. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest in November 1956. Thousands were killed. The uprising was crushed. Nagy was arrested, later executed.
And Khrushchev basically said it was a lesson to other communist leaders.
He did. He reportedly said it was a lesson to the leaders of all socialist countries. A very clear message. Don't step out of line.
But the USA, they didn't intervene militarily, did they? Despite all the talk of freedom. Why not?
It's a crucial point. The U.S. policy was containment, stopping communism spreading further.
Right.
It wasn't about rolling it back where it already existed, especially not right on the Soviet Union's doorstep. The risk was just too high.
Nuclear war.
The ultimate fear. Direct conflict between U.S. and Soviet troops in Hungary could have escalated incredibly quickly. So they condemned it, they helped refugees, but no military action.
How did that play out? Did it damage the U.S. reputation?
It certainly did in some quarters. People in Eastern Europe felt let down, and it probably made the Soviets feel more confident that the West wouldn't risk a major war over the satellite states.
Okay, so while the Soviets are dealing with uprisings in their sphere, their relationship with the other communist giant, China, is also going through some big changes. They started as allies, didn't they?
Oh, yes. When Mao Zedong won the Civil War and established the People's Republic in 1949, the Soviets were the first to recognize them. In 1950, they signed a treaty of friendship. It looked like a solid communist bloc.
But it didn't last. What went wrong? The Sino-Soviet split.
Several things, really. Ideology was part of it. Soviet communism was very focused on the industrial proletariat, the city workers. Mao's revolution was based much more on the peasantry, the rural population. He also resented the Soviet expectation that Moscow was the leader of the communist world. Mao saw China as an equal, developing its own path.
And Khrushchev criticizing Stalin didn't help.
That was a huge factor for Mao. He saw it as undermining the whole communist project, as revisionism. He'd respected Stalin, in a way. These ideological disputes combined with national interest and, frankly, personality clashes.
So it got quite hostile.
By the mid-1960s, yes. Openly hostile. They were denouncing each other, competing for influence in other countries, even had border clashes, a complete breakdown.
That must have changed the whole Cold War dynamic.
Yeah.
Having the two biggest communist powers fighting each other.
Absolutely. It shattered the idea of a monolithic communist threat. And crucially, it created an opportunity for the West, particularly the U.S.
Nixon going to China in '72.
Exactly. That visit was partly possible because of the Sino-Soviet split. The U.S. could play one off against the other. It was a major shift in the global balance of power.
Right. Let's shift focus geographically now to Asia. The Korean War, early 1950s, how did that become a Cold War battleground?
Well, like Germany, Korea was divided after World War II along the 38th parallel, communist North, backed by the Soviets, and a sort of capitalist authoritarian South, backed by the U.S.
Okay.
In June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, trying to reunify the country under communism. The U.S. saw this, probably rightly, as Soviet-backed aggression.
So containment policy kicks in again.
Big time. The U.S. led a United Nations force, though it was mostly U.S. troops to defend South Korea. But then China got involved, sending troops to support North Korea when the UN forces got close to the Chinese border.
Making it a proxy war. The U.S. and USSR weren't fighting directly, but they were backing opposite sides.
Precisely. It was bloody, brutal fighting. Millions died. And it showed the Cold War had gone global, beyond Europe.
Did it change U.S. policy much?
Hugely. It led to a massive increase in U.S. military spending. There was this key document, NSC 68, which basically called for a tripling of the defense budget to confront communism globally. So a much more militarized Cold War.
And the outcome in Korea?
Stalemate, basically. An armistice was signed in 1953, leaving Korea divided pretty much where it started, along the 38th parallel. That division still exists today, a real legacy of the Cold War.
And then there's Vietnam, another incredibly divisive and long conflict. What's the background there?
Vietnam had been part of French Indochina. After World War II, a nationalist and communist movement, the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, fought for independence from France.
And the French lost.
They did, culminating in their defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The Geneva Accords then temporarily divided Vietnam into a communist North and an anti-communist South.
And the U.S. got involved because...
Domino theory, that was the big fear. If South Vietnam fell to communism, the thinking went, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. The whole of Southeast Asia could follow like dominoes.
Containment again.
Exactly. So The U.S. backed the anti-communist government in South Vietnam, initially with money and advisors under Eisenhower and Kennedy,
But it escalated.
massively under President Johnson. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in '64, the U.S. sent hundreds of thousands of combat troops. It became America's war.
Another proxy war, though, right?
Yeah.
Soviets and Chinese backing the North.
Yes, North Vietnam received significant aid from both Moscow and Beijing. It was another arena for the superpowers to fight indirectly.
But unlike Korea, the U.S. didn't achieve its aims in Vietnam. What were the consequences of that?
Devastating, really. For the U.S., enormous cost in lives, over 58,000 Americans killed, and money. It deeply divided American society, sparking huge anti-war protests. Internationally, it was a massive blow to American prestige and power. The failure of containment there was undeniable. And for the Soviets, it was a huge propaganda victory. They could point to the mighty USA being defeated by a small communist nation.
Okay, let's swing back to Europe and to Berlin again.
Yeah.
The Berlin Wall, 1961. Why then?
Things were getting tense again over Berlin. A summit between Kennedy and Khrushchev in Vienna hadn't gone well, and crucially, there was this constant flow of people leaving East Germany through Berlin.
Go from East Berlin to West Berlin.
Yeah, because within Berlin, movement was still relatively free. East Germans, especially skilled workers and professionals, were voting with their feet, heading west for better lives. It was a brain drain, undermining the East German economy, and frankly, embarrassing the communist regime.
So the wall was their solution. Pretty drastic.
Incredibly drastic. Literally overnight, in August 1961, the East German authorities started building it. Barbed wire first, then concrete. It physically sealed off West Berlin from East Berlin and the rest of East Germany.
The immediate impact must have been horrendous. Families split.
Terrible. People trapped on one side or the other. It became the ultimate symbol of the Cold War division, the physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain. Kennedy's Ich bin ein Berliner speech captured that feeling.
Yeah.
He gave that speech in West Berlin in '63, showing solidarity.
But you mentioned earlier, paradoxically, the wall might have eased tensions in a way.
It's a complex argument, but yes. By stopping the flow of refugees, it removed a major source of friction and crisis. It stabilized the situation, albeit in a brutal way. The daily visible comparison between East and West Berlin was reduced, and the risk of a direct confrontation over the city probably lessened.
Right. Okay, finally, the event many say was the absolute closest call. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. Set the scene for us.
Cuba had had its revolution in 1959, bringing Fidel Castro to power. Castro aligned with the Soviet Union. The U.S. tried to overthrow him with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which just pushed Cuba closer to Moscow. Then, in October 1962, American U-2 spy planes flying over Cuba took photos.
And found.
Soviet nuclear missile launch sites under construction, intermediate-range missiles capable of hitting major U.S. cities within minutes.
Wow. Why on earth did Khrushchev put missiles there? It seems incredibly risky.
It was hugely risky. Several likely reasons, partly balancing the U.S. missiles already placed in Turkey, right near the Soviet border.
Okay. Tit for tat.
Kind of. Also, maybe Khrushchev felt pressure to show strength, both internationally and at home, and of course, protecting communist Cuba from another U.S. invasion attempt. He probably miscalculated how the U.S. would react.
So Kennedy finds out. What happens next, those 13 days?
13 days of unbelievable tension. Kennedy convened his advisors. Options ranged from doing nothing to diplomacy to a full-scale invasion of Cuba. The military chiefs favored airstrikes.
But he didn't go for that.
No. He opted for a naval quarantine, effectively a blockade around Cuba to stop Soviet ships delivering more missiles or equipment. And then intense, secret negotiations began between Washington and Moscow.
Nerve-wracking, doesn't even cover it.
No kidding. The world genuinely held its breath. There were moments where accidents or miscalculations could easily have triggered nuclear war.
How was the result?
Eventually, a deal was struck. Publicly, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade the island.
Okay.
Secretly, the U.S. also agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, though that wasn't announced at the time.
So disaster averted. What were the long-term effects?
Huge relief, obviously, but also a real sobering effect on both leaders and, well, the world. It showed just how close they'd come to annihilation. This led directly to setting up the hotline, a direct communication link between the White House and the Kremlin to prevent future misunderstandings escalating. And the following year, 1963, saw the signing of the Limited Test Ban Treaty, banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere, space, and underwater. So paradoxically, the closest call led to the first real steps in arms control, and maybe, just maybe, a slight thawing, or at least a more cautious approach in the Cold War.
It's quite a journey looking at all these events together, from Berlin, right after the war, through Hungary, Korea, Vietnam, Cuba. It really hits home how the Cold War wasn't just a U.S.-Soviet thing. It was truly global.
Absolutely. Berlin, Budapest, Havana, Hanoi. These weren't just local issues. They were all tangled up in that wider ideological battle, that competition for influence between East and West.
Driven by fear, by ideology, by security concerns.
All playing out on a global stage, often with devastating consequences for the people caught in the middle.
So thinking again about, the GCSE focus on conflict and tension between East and West up to 72, what's the big takeaway here?
I think the key thing to grasp is that you can't understand the Cold War just by looking at Moscow and Washington. You have to look at how this conflict manifested across the globe in proxy wars, in uprisings, in divided nations.
Right.
These weren't sideshows. They were the Cold War in many ways. They showed the reach and the impact of that central ideological struggle.
So a final thought for you listening. How might the patterns we've talked about today, this global competition, the role of ideology, the way local conflicts get caught up in bigger power struggles, how might those echoes from the Cold War still be relevant? When you look at international relations today, do you see similar dynamics playing out? What did this whole period teach us about managing conflict when ideologies clash so fiercely? Something to think about.